Let's turn to the book of James tonight. The book of James, chapter 1. Probably spend a little while here in the book of James, but for tonight, just a few verses here in chapter 1. James chapter 1, we'll start with verse number 1. Our main focus will be basically verses 2, 3, and 4, and then even verse 12 as well. James chapter 1 and verse number 1. James, a servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greeting. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. Jump down to verse number 12. Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. And so this evening we want to focus on the right attitudes. Notice especially those words, count it all joy. What attitude do we have when we go through trials and difficulties and it's, the word here is temptations, but really referring not so much to the like satanic allurements to sin, but just the trials of life and the difficulties that we face. Now, later on here, you'll see there is that other form of temptation as well. But these are the trials. And how do we have joy and rejoicing in those moments, in those times when we are facing the trials? And so let's focus on the right attitudes tonight. When I was just a teenager, I think that's about the age I would have been, maybe a boy. Not sure exactly the time frame, but probably a teenager. Anyway, we had a well-known evangelist that came through, preacher anyway, that he shared the story of we call him Grandpa. I guess maybe around here you might say Pawpaw. But the Grandpa was pranked by his visiting grandkids. And I think maybe they had lunch together or something. And after lunch, Grandpa went in there to the living room, sat down, and got comfortable in the recliner. And before very long, he was snoring away, or at least sleeping, napping a little bit there in the recliner. Well, those grandkids went to the refrigerator. I don't know how they knew about all this, but they went to the refrigerator. They found some, or maybe already knew that there was some Limburger cheese in there. Of course, Limburger cheese, if you're familiar with it at all, is very, very smelly, very stinky. And so they got a little bit of that Limburger cheese out of the refrigerator, and they tiptoed over to Grandpa there in the recliner. They got a little bit there, and he had a mustache. And so they found a way to just sort of smear a little bit of that Limburger cheese right there in his mustache. And then they backed off and they waited until the effects would become clear. Well, it didn't take very long, I guess, until the aroma of the cheese there in his mustache started to kind of work its way into his consciousness. And before very long, he's awake. And he sniffed. And then, however you want to put it, we'll just say he roared, "What stinks?" So he got up out of his chair. Nobody answered him apparently, and he got up out of his chair there, and he concluded, well, it must stink in the living room. I don't know what's going on here. Made his way out into the kitchen and took another sniff. Oh, the kitchen stinks too. And so I forget all the details. It may have been a closed-in porch or something. And he goes out on the porch, and the porch stinks. So finally he decides to get totally clear of it, totally rid of the smell. And he steps outside on the steps there or out into the yard, and he takes a big whiff of good, fresh air out there, but instead, it's the same old stink. And so he bellowed one more time. This time he said, "The whole world stinks." Really, obviously the problem was right under his nose. You know that very well. But often that may be the case for us as well. And if we're not careful, we can can find fault with this or that or something else, and we think, well, that's what stinks, and over here is where it stinks, and this is what causes the bad attitude or whatever else. But maybe the issue sometimes is right underneath our nose. And what about our own attitude in trials and difficulties? What about when things don't go our way? What about when we're struggling? Is it really that we're causing the stench in our own lives? And of course, we all face trials, we face difficulties. Again, that's really the interpretation of this initial aspect of temptations in this passage. Count it all joy when you fall into divers, or the divers there meaning various or a variety of temptations or trials, the difficulties of life that you're going through. When hard times come, when you don't know just what to do or how to navigate through these difficult times, when somehow it seems like everything's going wrong, what is your attitude? He said, count it all joy. And you know, it can be kind of easy for us, if we're not careful, it can be easy for us to start getting bent out of shape a little bit. And we think, well, you know, it shouldn't be like this, and I shouldn't have to go through this test. But when we read about these trials and difficulties, we see that they're actually for our growth in character. And you can read that just a little bit further there in verse 3 and then verse 4. It kind of gives us that indication. And again, remember, James is saying here, don't just endure it. That's part of it. But he says, count it all joy. In other words, really be glad that God has allowed you to go through these things, because they bring about good in your lives. In reality, we need to look past just that temporary setback, just the temporary problem, and recognize that God is still working on us and see the overall good that is being accomplished in us. Really, our joy should not just be found in a lack of trials, though sometimes we almost think of it that way. You know, if everything in my life was going good, I could just really be a Christian. But in reality, when things are going poorly and when we're struggling, that's when we need to count it all joy. That's when we need to get our eyes on Jesus. That's when we need to remember that He builds Christian character through the storms. Again, remember that God's working on us. He's the one bringing about even the good that is accomplished through trials. Obviously, later on here it says that God doesn't tempt any man, particularly in a temptation to sin, but He does sometimes allow trials to come our way and to pile upon us, sometimes maybe even from unfair sources. But He wants us to keep the right attitude and remember that it brings about good in our lives. And so tonight I want to focus on that issue of the right attitudes and maybe just a few aspects of this rejoicing. The first one that we want to notice with you tonight is in this the whole issue of going through trials, and it's pretty difficult sometimes, but I want us to think about this a little bit. We ought to be rejoicing in the proving, the testing, rejoicing in those testing times. Now, this focus is probably the biggest challenge of all, because nobody really likes to go through trials, I'm sure. Obviously, this is a recognition there's more to the trial than just what I feel at the moment. But we need to recognize that the test brings about a testimony. A song that I think I've shared with you before along that line, just the words of it, that He can turn our test into a testimony. And again, remember, these are not the satanic temptations to sin, but the trials of our faith and the trials of our focus. And am I really willing to put God to the test and say, I will believe you. I will hold on to you in the storm. I will trust you in the difficulty. We need to remember and recognize that the proving grounds, or as we mentioned this morning, even the crucible where the precious metal goes, put to the fire, is actually to bring about better things, a purity, a refining. He wants to help us to be the person that we ought to be in the end. After the storm's over, after the trial's done, after He brings us through that testing time, He wants us to be able to be a real testimony, and we would be better Christians as a result of the test. Could I just remind us tonight, as long as we chafe at the trials, as long as we just let them play around in our mind and we can't figure them out and we don't really like them and we're not really doing very well at trusting God through them, we're likely going to be stunted in our growth for God. But He wants to use the test. And again, here He says, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations, when you go through the various trials, when it seems like the devil is just fighting so strong. And a lot of times we do blame them on the devil, but sometimes it might be that God is trying to work on us. But what is our attitude when we go through those times of proving? Again, we're especially instructed here to rejoice. And I believe a big part of that, and we'll probably get to that in just a moment, but it's a big part of that is because of the result they bring, the blessing that comes because of going through the trial. Rejoice in the proving. Maybe it'd help us a little bit tonight. I think maybe just lately, maybe even this morning, we talked a little bit about the wandering in the wilderness. And you think about how we point fingers at them. Remember, the children of Israel came out of Egypt, and before very long, they're thirsty. Of course, first of all, I guess one of the early things was the Red Sea, and so now we're afraid we're going to be killed, And then they go a little further, and now we don't have anything to eat. Now we don't have anything to drink. It's too hot. It's on and on and on. Or part of it, not anything to eat, but we don't want just this manna. We want to have flesh. We want to have some kind of meat to eat, and so it's on and on. It seemed like every little while there was something coming along that they would chafe at the trial. They would chafe at the trouble. They didn't want to trust God. They believed they got to go back to Egypt, and it was just over and over and over again. But really later on, when they look back, when some maybe of the leaders, the godly men or whomever may point back and say, do you remember how God took care of you back there? At the moment they were chafing, at the moment they were sorry they were going through this, at the moment they were murmuring and complaining and really displeasing God. But later on they could look back and remember, you know what? Our sandals and our clothes never wore out. We always had enough to eat. We were provided for in water to drink. We had God's goodness over and over and over. They could look back later, but the problem was at the moment they were complaining and bitter and all those attitudes that just were wrong. Sometimes maybe we ought to just stop a moment and say, Lord, is that me? How am I handling my trials? How am I handling my problems in life? Am I always complaining? Am I always, giving some sort of a grief story, a sob story? Or am I trusting God? We are to be rejoicing. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse temptations. Rejoice in the proving. Not only do we rejoice in the proving, but we also are to be rejoicing, and maybe this is a little easier, but we can rejoice in the product or the final result, what God's bringing about in us. And of course, when we look at the troubles of life, we need to remember that it's not just some thorn in our pathway with no rose, but often at least, and I suppose we could probably say always as God sees it, but we don't always recognize maybe at the time, but always there is something good that's being accomplished even through the trials we face. Those things are not meant to destroy us, but to build us up, to help us, to strengthen us. Now, the obvious product of our trials is the patience that he mentions right here in verse number 3. He first of all talks about it there, and then also in verse 4. But he says, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. Another way of thinking of that, not just patience as in, willing to wait, but a perseverance that presses on even when it's so long, even when we struggle and we don't know where to turn or how to get through the storm. We have a patience that perseveres. But beyond that, there's also a maturity. There is a steadiness. There is a growth a deepness to our spiritual life because we go through the storm. Now, I know many times we would prefer not to have ever a problem. Not ever suffer any calamity or trouble. We'd rather just have the calm winds and nice sunshine and all those things. There's a variety of examples we could use here. Obviously, we think about even just a little sapling, and if there's no wind, no problem at all, it's probably not going to be very sturdy. It has to be able to whip back and forth a little bit and get those roots down deep and kind of get some stability. Another little example is a place on earth that I've read about that for, I guess, basically all year long, the sun's just shining, clear blue sky, and you might think that'd be a paradise, but no, it's a desert instead. I believe it's in South America. The point is, we need the difficult times to strengthen us, to build us, to get our roots deep, and to help us to trust God more. It's easy for us to think in our minds, I just want everything to go well for me. But God builds our strength through even the storms. He builds our ability to withstand the temptation. I'm talking now about the devil's tactic. He builds that little by little, even through the tough times. If we were never tempted, if we never had to resist, if we never build up our willpower against the enemy, then even a small temptation might get us off track. But he tries to build us and strengthen us. There is a necessary development that is brought to perfection through the trials, through the difficulties. As we are put through those testing times, then perseverance and patience takes hold, and we begin to grow. We get our feet more firmly planted in the grace of God. Again, this patience is a perseverance through the trials, but it's not often easy, and maybe we could say never is easy. And sometimes maybe we think we've suffered enough. Maybe we think that we've gone through too much storm, and it's just not fair. We faced enough difficulty, but when we push through to the end, we may find that God has taught us new lessons, and He's helped us to grasp new things. And we recognize a little more of what God, or God's character perhaps, is like. The best saints are not those who have never suffered, not those who have never gone through a storm, but those who have weathered the storms, those who have had their anchor firmly pulled fast in the soil of life, so to speak, or maybe we should say more so in the rock of ages. But those are the ones that are the true saints. Those are the ones that have proven God true. And He helps us to gain new ground little by little through the storm. Again, our attitudes about life are critical here. They're so important. Again, if we're not careful, we can get the wrong spirit, the wrong attitude. We feel like somehow God's not being fair with us, or we begin to get sour. And really, there may be a number of people that even though they've had a good experience with God, but little by little, through the storms of life, through the trials they've gone through things they don't understand, somehow the devil has brought in some root of bitterness, and it begins to trouble them, and it begins to whittle away at their spiritual vitality until finally they end up being critical. They end up being hard to get along with because the hardships of life have not brought about patience, have not brought about perseverance, but instead have undermined their faith and undermined their spiritual vitality until they are sour. God help us. God help us to rejoice in the trials as He brings about a stability and growth, this patience that's referred to here. Let me just ask you a question here tonight. Are you more interested in your own personal comforts or in really, truly growing, deepening in the things of God? We are so spoiled sometimes, and sometimes it seems like when God would like to do some real work on us, we would resist it so much because, that doesn't fit into my plan for comfort. my plan for pleasure, my plan for, serving God to feel good and to have Him bless me. But sometimes we need to recognize there's something more going on here than just the little trouble and problem that I'm facing. Sometimes it may seem like a big trouble, but that thing in my life, it might be a lot bigger than that. And that God is trying to deepen us, make us what He wants us to be. And so tonight I'll ask you, are you only interested in comfort? Or are you truly interested in character development and being more like Christ? We should rejoice at His work, rejoicing in the product. So we've first of all looked at the proving, that the storms, the trials, the temptations as they're referred to here. We rejoice in the product or the end results, the possibilities of what God's trying to do in us. And then lastly, maybe I could just mention to you from verse 12 that we can also rejoice in the prize. And you kind of skip over some of those middle verses. There's a number of things right there. If you lack wisdom, ask of God. Don't be double-minded in your seeking after God. There are various things there. But let's jump down to verse 12. And he says there, blessed is the man that endureth temptation. For when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life. So there is a prize. There's more rejoicing than just in the trials, but also in the end result. And of course, first of all, we're reminded that there's often the temptation to give up, because he's talking here about enduring. Blessed are those, and rejoice if you are able to endure, if you can overcome the enemy, if you can stay true, if you can get deeper in the things of God, if your character does develop, then be thankful, be rejoicing. That's kind of what's happening here, because there is the temptation to give up. We must endure the hardship of life with the right spirit. Well, really, I suppose we would just say that the good that God wants to do in us, we lost. We missed out on the blessings that God has for us. But then there's a second aspect as well, and that's the end of the fight. Yes, we must endure, and not just for a few moments, not just for one storm or another, but throughout the whole process until finally we receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love Him. And so there is a crown waiting for those who will boldly press on and stay true in spite of the storm and keep the right attitude and keep our eyes on Jesus and all those things that are so necessary in spite of the disappointments, the discouragements, the setbacks, all those things. In spite of it all, we've got to keep our focus on the crown. Now, I know that's so common. We've preached about it. You've heard about it over and over. But right here we have a reminder that the storms, the trials, the difficulties don't have to destroy us. Very simply, life's just not always fair. It's not always nice. It's not always rosy. But our job is to keep a right attitude, a right spirit in the midst of it all. Come out on the other side a conqueror. The enemy would like to use any storm that comes our way as a shipwreck in our lives. But God wants to help us to grow and develop, get our roots down deep, and get strong in Him. We ought to count it all joy because God is working on us. Now, I'm not saying that every situation that comes your way is just, joyful and lovely and we just are so thrilled. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that He points our hearts and minds deeper than just the feelings of the moment and says, count it all joy because God is deepening you. God is establishing you. God is helping you to be stronger. He's building your character. And so God help us to come out the other side victorious and stronger. There is a prize we can rejoice in. Well, now let's get back to the beginning. What's the attitude that a Christian should have toward trials? It's easy for us to get a little bit sour. Now, I'm not saying that's what we ought to do. Certainly not. We are to count it all joy. We are to be joyful. We are to be trusting Him. We are to be looking to Him for victory. And in spite of the storm, in spite of the trial, We are to keep sweet. We're to be an example to others of the grace of God working in our hearts. Again, so often we are looking for temporary pleasure instead of permanent growth. And so we pray, oh Lord, get me out of this. I don't want to be like this. I don't want to have to deal with this. Deliver me from this. But in reality, it might be just the curriculum we've got to go through. And maybe we ought to be saying, Lord, help me to learn from this. Help me to have a sweet spirit. Help me to have the right attitude. God help us to get our eyes on the importance of spiritual growth through trials. Count it all joy. Rejoice that God is still working in our lives, that He cares enough to teach us and train us and pull us toward Him. Build our character into what He wants us to be. But the question is, do we have the right attitude? We all face storms. Yours may be a little different than mine, but we all have them. So what is your attitude about it? Are you willing to be sweet in spite of the storm? In spite of the cutting remarks? In spite of the hardships? Are you willing to be sweet? We are to count it all joy and keep our eyes on Jesus. He is trying to build us into the Christian He wants us to be. Let's let Him do it. It's so easy for us to just focus on what I feel right now. But let's get our eyes on Jesus and say, Lord, make me like You. Use my trials to be a testimony to others and a deepening to me. God can do that. Let's trust Him, even in our trials this week.